Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
Growing more with less is the mantra of Nebraska's corn farmers, and they're using incredible technology to do it. Soil moisture monitors let them know when their crop needs water and how much. GPS systems eliminate overlaps in the field, saving fuel and money. New hybrids reduce the use of pesticides and increase yields. When you're talking new technology and innovation, Nebraska corn farmers are all ears. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, Television for Agricultural Business Decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Elaine Kub analyzes corn and soybean markets. Roger Elmore explains new hail damage research in corn. Bob Klein looks at the current condition of Nebraska's winter wheat. And Rick Funston talks about pre-calving nutrition and estrus synchronization. Elaine Kub is our grain market analyst this week. The USDA said Thursday at its Agricultural Outlook Forum it expects U.S. farmers this spring to plant 89 million acres of corn, down from 90.6 a year ago, and 83.5 million acres of soybeans, down slightly from 83.7 last spring. The agency will release its report on prospective plantings the final day of March. Elaine joined us Friday morning to look at the latest movements in corn and soybean markets. The projections and numbers that we're getting from USDA's forum this week, how do they come up with those numbers?
I think it's just economists sitting in a room making projections based on just typically what you would expect given the market conditions that are in place and given the trends of the past. But it's not based on actually talking to farmers or taking any real data. It's just sort of a projection of a trend, and it's just a starting point. You know, we don't have any way of knowing what the 2015 planted acres will be at this point. Nobody's been surveyed. We don't know what the prices will. I mean, we don't know anything, but we just need a starting place to start making projections into the spring.
Using it as such, then, for the acres that we'll see at the end of March, the estimates, what do you think it's close? Do you think it's along those lines?
I think they made some very reasonable baseline projections this week at their Outlook meeting because they kept corn, you know, pretty steady, 89 million acres. So this wouldn't be like a huge 90 million acre apocalypse or anything like that. And they dropped a bunch of wheat acres. I think the most bearish piece of information there is that they showed that the wheat acres would go down and yet ending stocks would increase by 10%. So they're saying that they're expecting to have lots and lots of wheat in the U.S. and not get it shipped out. And hopefully, for the folks who have to plant wheat, who have to keep it in their rotation, hopefully the market responds this way and the wheat acres actually do go down like that. Otherwise, that ending stocks number would be even more apocalyptically bearish.
What about the ending stocks in corn and soybeans?
Yeah, they showed that the soybean ending stocks number would come up and that the corn ending stocks number would come down compared to the previous year, which makes sense, right? They're just showing, you know, a general leveling or comparison of favoring one versus the other and coming back to an equilibrium.
So old crop soybeans this morning, at least as we talk, are hanging above $10 a bushel. Do you think they'll have to fight hard to stay above that level?
I think they really struggled at the first part of the week to find some willing buyers staying above, and that seemed to be the level. Like if they could make it there, then they might be able to continue this trend, and if they couldn't make it, the volatility could have gone back the other way. But the soybean meal was really the leader, so there's definitely a demand for that soy protein, and they continued to make these gains even while the Chinese are on their Lunar New Year holiday. So it's not just Chinese buying necessarily, not just the last dregs of that before the South American harvest comes to market. So I think it's quite a strong signal that yes, they might have some continued support here. Record
soybean crop in the U.S., record crop in Brazil, likely a record crop in Argentina. How much of it is factored already into the market?
I think the steadiness that we saw before this week, you know, thought that we're going to have those huge crops. I think there's still an opportunity for those record large numbers, the 94.5 million metric tons out of Brazil, for instance, to be pared back. You hear from private estimators that there's slightly more damage in Mato Grosso do Sul and places like that that maybe are not fully factored in yet. So I think there's chances for little pieces of bullishness to come back in yet, but I think it's mostly, I'm not talking about a major rally.
Okay, let's talk about corn. Kind of stuck in the mud, I guess, over the last few weeks here. What would get you excited about selling?
I would be motivated to start making little pieces of sales already, but the old crop market, it stayed like in that 20-cent range for the past 2.5 weeks. It's very, very low volatility, which can be good news in February as we're averaging prices for crop insurance purposes. Sure. But as far as new crop, you know, that 420 level in the futures market for the December 2015 contract, you know, considering these outlooks for 2015 have another large corn crop and we don't have any reason yet to really worry about drought or a major problem in production in the U.S. yet, you know, this is the time of year when you might start making some sales.
Tell me how the strength of the dollar is playing with the export market.
Yeah, it's not helpful, and it's particularly not helpful to the markets that really rely on exports, like wheat, for instance. You know, we are really struggling when our buyers, Egypt, it can go and find cheaper wheat elsewhere, obviously, and it's struggling for the hog market, for instance. That's another market that really relies on exports, and we have a lot of competition from other countries that have weaker currencies, so it's not helpful to certain markets more than others.
Do you think that the dollar will continue to remain strong?
I do. I don't see any reason. I mean, the reasons that the dollar are strong now are that investors need a place to park safe money. There's negative interest rates in Europe, so we're still the place to come to for that. There's belief that the U.S. economy, you know, can be optimistic about that. So all of those factors that have contributed to make the dollar this strong so far are still in place. You know, the dollar hasn't been rushing to new highs in the past couple of weeks, so maybe it's time for it to start doing that again, which would be bearish to our commodities that we're trying to sell. Yeah.
Next week, Mike Briggs will join us to look at cattle markets. As a reminder, Friday, February 27th is the deadline to update base acres and yield. March 31st is the deadline for ARC and PLC decisions. While Nebraska corn farmers last year matched their record for yield at 179 bushels per acre, the growing season in many parts wasn't an easy one. Of the crop insurance indemnity payments to those farmers in 2014, Nebraska Extension economist Corey Walters estimates more than $100 million came from corn crop yield losses. Arguably, one of the more damaging storms occurred in early June when hail and winds pounded fields across the state. While the impact was significant, Nebraska Extension agronomist Roger Elmore says monitoring affected corn plants after those storms may have changed future recommendations between replanting fields and letting the crop grow.
On the 3rd of June, there was a massive storm. It had set several fingers of destruction across the state from northeast Nebraska into central Nebraska. The corn was probably V3 to V5, so 3rd to 5th leaf, so it might have been anywhere from 6 to 10 inches tall, something like that. And soybeans a little bit shorter, but about the same, probably about the same growth stage. And some fields were literally mowed off. Up by Yuling, it looked like a shredder had gone through and just cut it right, not at an inch, but right down to the soil surface. So it was massive destruction. After these storms went through, you decided to take a look at these plants and maybe figure out how they would last the rest of the growing season. Tell me about the process of what you did in these fields. Yeah, the textbook would say that if you have corn, so I'll just talk specifically on corn here, that if you have corn between less than V6, so it's less than the 6th leaf stage, it will survive even if you cut it off or freeze it off or whatever, it's going to survive. And the reason for that, the growing point is below the ground until that point. But you know, when we were up at Yuling and out at Bradshaw and by Marquette there, it was clear that that wasn't happening. You usually give it a few days to see what kind of regrowth is going to happen, and it became very evident right away, within 5 to 6 days, that that normal was not going to happen, that we were literally losing plants. They were starting to die already. Because? There was a bacterial soft rot or stalk rot that invaded the plants. It invaded the stems and then started creeping down and eventually killed the growing point, which was below ground, indeed. And that was helped by the hail a little bit? Oh yeah, yeah. what the hail, this is a hypothesis, so I am just guessing here, that the hail, slowed down growth dramatically, and it had to restart. It had to kickstart again the whole growth process. But in the process, it set it back, and the weather conditions after the storm, they were not conducive or were not good for very rapid growth and development. So the corn's sitting there in a very stressed out state, and the bacteria probably loved that environment and just took off like gangbusters and started killing plants.
What about the plants that didn't have that problem?
Well, that's what we studied. We went into probably 14 or 15 different environments. In other words, they were locations and different hybrids, and across the state from Marquette all the way up to Yulee and beyond, and over to Cass County as well. And we staked out 100 plants in each one of those fields, and some of them were already dead, so we noted that, and then we gave a visual rating on how those individual plants that did survive, what they looked like. And one plant in our 1 to 5 scale looked almost healthy. It had some battered leaves and maybe a little stripping, maybe a little bruising, and a 5 was dead.
From what you saw at the end of the season, does it change your recommendation or your thoughts about what would happen after a hailstorm again?
Oh certainly.
Because?
And we've seen this before, where hail will come in and damage plants, and the plants won't survive, but the textbooks usually don't say that. So the story is that if you hail or frost or somehow cut off the top of a corn plant before V6, it may survive instead of it will survive. And that may survive, that little bit of a space there for some movement, or a little bit of waffling, I guess you call it, is because we don't know for sure what the bacterial organisms are going to do to that plant, how the plant's going to recover, how fast it's going to recover, the weather after the storm, and all those factors really do make a difference in plant responses.
Roger says final yields from the plants Nebraska Extension's team monitored haven't been determined yet. The 2 ears on the left were both from damaged fields. The ear in the background came from a field with 20 to 30% hail damage. The ear in the foreground was more typical, Roger says, coming from an area where the survival rate of about 40% could be common. Chuck Essay of Alliance has been chosen as the Nebraska Alfalfa Marketing Association's Producer of the Year. In the February Nebraska Farmer, you'll learn about Essay's production practices and his marketing strategies. Essay raises 1,300 acres of irrigated alfalfa in the Nebraska Panhandle. He markets all of his dairy quality alfalfa about 200 miles from his farm to Johnson Dairy in Eaton, Colorado. You can read more about why he places importance on marketing relationships with customers in the February Nebraska Farmer. At the beginning of the month, Nebraska's National Agricultural Statistics Service listed 61% of Nebraska's winter wheat as good to excellent. The next look at the shape of this year's crop will come at the beginning of March, but Nebraska Extension's Bob Klein says some growers are concerned fluctuating temperatures might have taken a toll on plants. We talked with Bob in North Platte Tuesday morning about why recent weather might have negatively affected some of the state's winter wheat.
Yeah, there's been a lot of concern because of the warm-ups we had and then also cool downs. And we say that, if we get temperatures over 50 during the daytime and then above freezing at night, that wheat wants to start growth, especially if the soil is relatively dry, because dry soil cools down and warms up about 6 times faster than moist soil. So that's where we have the biggest problem, is where we have dry soil and then get these extremes in temperature during the daytime and then keeping above freezing at night. So there is some concern out there.
Would you classify the soils as dry, or are they moist right now?
Well, it depends where you're at. Most of it's pretty moist. We've had some pretty good snowfall and so forth in some areas and had some rain at planting time. So in most cases, our seed beds are pretty good at planting, and it's carried through the fall here. In some cases, we got some excessive growth last fall, but not many areas. Our biggest concern is on the terrace tops and so forth. They dry out from the wind and so forth, and then we can see some winter injury on that. Right now, we would not expect widespread winter injury at this time unless the conditions continue and we get some more warm weather and then some real nasty cold weather and so forth following, without giving a chance for that wheat to kind of harden off again.
So you don't expect that it's going to be a widespread problem. Is that because of the moisture situation?
Yeah, because of the moisture we had and pretty good seed beds and so forth. Another thing that we had at planting time was good this year is we could get these drills and get the seed where it should be placed. When it's really dry sometimes and soil gets hard, we can't get those seed placed deep enough, and then those crowns are real close to the soil surface, and that's where we can really see lots of injury, because those crowns are really subject to the warm up and cool down, and then wheat starts to grow and so forth. So we like that crown to be in the soil, and that depends so much on our depth of seeding at planting time. The other thing we can have is a big problem sometimes is these big drills, and then we don't get enough weight, especially on the outside plant units and so forth, and they run pretty shallow, and then that wheat's not placed very deep, and then we see a lot of injury because of those crowns being near the soil surface.
As farmers start to think about maybe fertilizing and weed control, what are some things to keep in mind as we get towards that time of year?
Yeah, one of the things we found several years ago in some research we did here in the North Platte area is that when we combine fertilizers with herbicides, that sometimes we'd have some injury. We never know exactly when this is going to occur. Now, we think there's a better possibility of having injury this year because of the weakened condition of some of the wheat, because of these alternating high temperatures and low temperatures and so forth. So our general recommendation is, as soon as we get good field conditions in the spring, go out and put the fertilizer on, and then wait and then time the herbicide when it's appropriate for the weeds you're trying to control.
Do you want to reinforce to me some of the resistance problems with weeds you're having in this part of the state for some farmers?
Yeah, it's a big problem. You know, we have resistant kochia to a number of things and so forth. And so you can be doing a good job controlling your kochia, but it can blow in 20, 30, 40 miles away. So if you plan any program, look at, and there's a good chance you're going to have resistant weeds out there, so you've got to modify your herbicide control program. I know we had a lot of failures this past year because of some resistance to some of the herbicide modes of action, and so we got to do a better job of planning for that. A good reference for that is our weed management guide, EC 130, and it has a lot of categories in there on the herbicide modes of action and then how to handle the resistant weeds.
On the Market Journal website, we'll link to the 2015 Guide for Weed Management in Nebraska. During our visit to North Platte, we also spoke with Nebraska Extension beef cattle reproductive physiologist Rick Funston about the calving and breeding seasons. We talked with Rick Tuesday morning about estrus synchronization, why producers don't want to overfeed heifers, and the importance of pre-calving nutrition.
Well, we've had a pretty good winter for getting cattle through on fairly limited harvested feedstuffs. We just brought our pregnant heifers home yesterday from corn stalks, and they come home in reasonable condition with a little bit of supplementation. I think now, though, it's very important to make sure that we balance rations or diets for these heifers so they're not deficient in anything going into calving, because nutrition is vitally important to that developing fetus, but also setting up that cow that hasn't lactated yet to produce high quality colostrum and milk, which really helps that calf get off to a good start with its immune system. And research has shown if we have diets deficient in protein and energy, that colostrum quality and quantity can be compromised, and subsequent calf health too. Maybe even more importantly, though, we want to have those heifers at least maintaining or gaining condition going into calving to set her up to breed back herself, with a little bit of caution of don't overdo it. We don't want them gaining out in excess of what they're going to gain during the breeding season, for example.
Why is it so important not to overfeed?
Yeah, and in all the breeding females, sometimes we think having real high energy and protein diets are going to set those animals up for very good pregnancy rates. And again, I think moderation is the key, because oftentimes in a feedlot situation we can overfeed energy and protein pretty readily with high quality byproducts like distillers and corn gluten feed. Corn's cheap now. tendency to want to do that. But if we have heifers and heifer calves gaining greater than they're going to gain when they're establishing pregnancy, we can actually have a higher incidence of embryonic loss. Oftentimes we think we need to feed a concentrated protein supplement to these first calf heifers after calving, and I think one of the things we need to realize is on an all forage diet, we really won't meet energy requirements for that first calf heifer with just roughage. So we need to really balance that, and protein may be adequate, you know, depending on the hay quality, but we may have to come in with something that's high in energy, may also be high in protein, but energy tends to be the first limiting nutrient in a first calf heifer and in her diet, because she's still growing, she's milking for the first time, and her physical capacity to take in roughage is much less than an older cow.
As you look at estrus synchronization, what are some things to shoot for in that regard?
Yeah, we want, in our breeding program, we want to make sure we front load the breeding season to have a high percent of females pregnant early, because I mean that literally drives the system of profitability in a ranching operation or any cow-calf operation. Those steers that are born early in the calving season are older, heavier, all the way to harvest if we choose to feed them. The heifers born early are greater fertility, they're heavier at breeding. So one of the tools we have to do that is estrus synchronization, and we have some excellent protocols, some very simplistic. We've got those on our beef website and a webinar on estrus synchronization on our beef.unl.edu website. We can use synchronization with artificial insemination. We're in the middle of bull buying season now, and people are setting up, and I think we often forget that synchronization benefits can also be achieved with natural service as well. A very simple program that we've used at the Goodmanson Ranch is to turn the bulls in and then 5 days later give a shot of prostaglandin, and that has really tightened up our breeding season and thus calving season. And I'm not advocating to calve earlier in the year. It's whenever it works for your operation, which is an individual decision.
Next week, Nebraska Extension Beef Range Systems Specialist Aaron Stalker will join us to talk about supplemental vitamin needs in cattle. Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. During this past week, of course, we've dealt with the very brutal temperatures that have invaded much of the eastern part of the United States. So well below normal temperatures was a rule. And of course, we had a couple of waves of precipitation move through the state. The first one, of course, was in that Monday time frame through Tuesday morning, when we seen some flurry activity develop into a band of light to moderate snowfall from portions of west central Nebraska through central Nebraska. Most of the totals basically in the 2 to 3 inch range around the Grand Island region, and lighter totals as you headed eastward. But with the wind and the blowing conditions, it created some tricky conditions on the interstates until the system itself passed to the south of us. And then of course we had another wave move through and impacted more of eastern Nebraska on Thursday with some light snowfall accumulations. Most totals that we've seen so far have come on in under an inch, but we still are seeing old Mother Nature at work with these late snows, and it appears that there's several more opportunities as we go through this next 7-day period for additional snow. So let's take a look at the upper air pattern and see how this may progress. First thing I'll draw your attention to is that we have another plunge of cold Arctic air moving into our region, and then we have this energy pivoting around this broad upper air trough. And this is in response to the breaking down of the North Atlantic ridge that has been causing a big long wave trough along the eastern United States. Now this broke down, we're starting to see a more broad trough across most of the United States. So this system right now is projected to remain just to the south of Nebraska with the heavier snowfall. Accumulation totals today are likely to be from I-80 southward, with the heaviest totals right now focused from southwest Nebraska through south central Nebraska, and it looks like we could see somewhere in the area of 2 to 3 inches before this is all said and done with. The closer you get to northern Nebraska, the less you're going to have to deal with snowfall, probably just looking at a few flurries, but the main brunt will be a cold air rushing in on the back side of the surface low that will pull the Arctic air in for Sunday. And as we get into Sunday, you'll see that the system moves to the Great Lakes, and we have this cold air pivoting around. So the coldest temperatures will be in northeast Nebraska Nebraska, the warmest in southwest Nebraska, and a piece of that energy that broke off of that trough will kind of migrate toward California and then slowly start to make its way across the southern plains as we progress through the week. Now, as we get into the day on Monday, you'll see the system starting to get strengthened up, but we're still seeing a little bit of cold air coming into our region. Although temperatures will modify somewhat, there still may be some upslope flow conditions developing in the Panhandle that will generate some flurry activity, and more concentrated snows will be in the Rocky Mountain region. Now, as we get into Tuesday, you'll start to see some of this energy trying to pivot and slide across the Central Plains. Right now, most of the major activity states to the south of us, if this lifts anywhere near about a half state closer to us, then we will be dealing with some significant snow accumulations possible across northern Kansas and southern Nebraska, particularly as we get into Tuesday night and into Wednesday. And by Wednesday, you'll see the system rapidly move toward the east, but we get a big stretch of cold air coming on the backside, sort of like we've been dealing with. So we're going to be looking at well below normal temperatures once again, and with this energy coming down, we should see some snow trying to break out, particularly as we get into the day on Thursday as the system tries to get its act together and generate over the Central Rockies. That will push snowfall across northern Nebraska and start to shift some of that towards southern Nebraska, particularly as we get late in the day on Thursday. And there may be even additional snowfall development during Friday, depending on where this actual trough sets up. So overall, a fairly stormy pattern off and on during this week. In terms of temperatures, we're looking at very cold conditions to end the week. Then we see a slight moderation of temperatures through midweek before the next system comes through and once again brings Arctic air into our region. We look at the 8 to 14 day forecast. There is some signs that we'll start to see some modification of this cold. And in terms of precipitation, it looks like above normal moisture for a good portion of the center part of the country.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews can be found on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean markets, hail damage research in corn, the condition of Nebraska's winter wheat, and heifer development. Next week, Mike Briggs will join us to analyze cattle markets. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Whether it's spring planting, fall harvesting, or just a drive across the state, soy biodiesel helps a diesel-powered engine operate in a demanding job. Soybean oil from Nebraska soybeans makes biodiesel a renewable fuel that's also environmentally responsible. The soybean checkoff plays a major role in supporting the use and availability of biodiesel. The Nebraska Soybean Board, growing opportunity from the ground up.